Hi, I'm Paul, and today we're talking about why agencies really need to reinvent themselves, that AI is probably not just a tool, but really a good reason to reinvent yourself from a business model as well as from a service point of view, and really a good way and challenge the status quo and redefine what creative means today and also what delivers value. And of course, that you should probably talk to your customers a little bit more often.
Welcome to Brands of Value, the podcast about evergreen ideas and strategies in marketing and business. I am your host, David Götz, and today's guest is someone who naturally pulls conversations into the future, Paul Krauss. We first met as colleagues, but since then he has moved on to become a partner for AI at TeamOne developers in Stuttgart. Paul works at the intersection of e-commerce technology and AI, and he has a sharp sense for what these shifts actually mean for business and service models of tomorrow. What I value most about Paul is how he cuts through the noise, breaks down complexity, and gets to the point without decoration. Welcome to Brands of Value, Paul.
Nice to be here.
I always ask my guests at the start of the show what they interpret value to be. What is value to you, Paul?
Value is everything that makes people happy, brings them forward, and gives them a reason to pay more.
In agencies, value is obviously a huge topic as well, because we're discussing what value an agency can bring in a changing world. And we're exploring as to what needs to change in order for agencies, and especially marketing agencies, to persist in the future. Let's start with a situation analysis. What issues do you currently see with agencies?
What you see is a very fragmented market. And at the same time, you see a very few big players that really dominate the market with the biggest share in terms of market size. So they have roughly about 50 to 60% in revenue. In certain areas, it's even more. And then you have the very small agencies, like this is what I meant with fragmented, where you have these like 1 person, 2 person, probably up to 5 or 10 person agencies that are work very well in a local environment or very focused on a specific use case, and they don't struggle so much, let's say it like this, because they can always find equivalent customers that are also very small but need a certain kind of professionalism. It's super hard for these kind of mid-size agencies, everything between, let's say, 20 to 200 people in the company, where you have this squeezed margin situation, where you have also this kind of stagnating growth, and where you have the major amount of agencies really fighting for the mid-sized players, because all of the big brands are already in the hands of the big agencies. It's not like in the early days where all these small agencies were able to attract super huge attractive brands and help them out with online or social media. Nowadays, it's became pretty hard to grow and even build a sustainable agency model in this kind of platform-driven economy.
Do you think that's also to do with the fact that lots of larger players get lots of small agencies, but there's no real lead agency role anymore?
That's a very good question, actually. The assumption is probably that customers feel that they can be the lead agency in a way, because this is probably one of the reasons why they build in-house capacities. Not all of them, but a lot of them, where they actually, what they try to do is like manage all the different players and make sure they all deliver on brand, on time, etc. And so they in-housed this kind of lead functionality, which works very well if you have a good in-house capacities, and works very bad if you have bad hiring decisions in the past, where you probably have a CMO that's not really into kind of social media, for example, and then there's no focus on social media. So you have a big problem with a kind of personal bias based on the roles that you hire for decision making in terms of marketing.
One of our clients, for example, every contract has to go through through the in-house sourcing department first, and sourcing makes a lot of the marketing decisions in that way, because they decide what gets done and what doesn't get done, not the actual marketing people in the end.
Yeah, but that's a typical kind of development that has also led to kind of mediocre performance in a way, because if you're always looking for the cheapest vendor, you end up getting some kind of very comparable mediocre results. It's not a surprise, because if you're really looking to optimize in terms of quantity and try to find the cheapest vendor, you end up getting the cheapest result as well. There can be like no real one-to-one correlation, but what you end up with is that the vending departments are really wrongly incentivized on hiring the cheapest player, not the best player, because if you do it bad, you have to do it twice most of the times, especially in software engineering or in more strategic kind of projects. These kind of buy cheap approaches end up kind of disastrous a lot of times.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the big issues that we have with the current procurement system at our state level as well, where they are by law obliged to take the cheapest option if there is no actual like threat that they can discern to whatever law or structure or integrity or something like that. And in other countries, like I think in Austria or Switzerland, they are obliged to take the second cheapest option, which leads to a lot more realistic bids because people don't just bid with the lowest number possible, knowing that they'll make a loss and recoup that with some rework or something like that. But people go in with a lot more realistic calculations and then actually deliver better results. I think that approach maybe should go into business as well. Maybe not always taking the cheapest option, because the cheapest option and incentivizing the cheapest option often comes at the cost of quality.
Yeah, totally. And since we started this discussion with value or value-based approaches, it's kind of ironic in how even if the agency started thinking value-based in terms of their pricing, they end up just talking to the vendor department and talking about hourly rates, even if they maybe proceeded in a way not to charge for hours, but rather for outcome. I think the system incentivizes the wrong kind of partnership in a way that you still consider agencies as a kind of a vendor rather than a partner. You still need to talk about money in a certain way, but you should rather talk about outcomes, not so much about hourly rates, because it really incentivizes the wrong model, especially in the times of AI.
Hours don't create value, right?
Yeah.
It's the outcome that creates a value. And the way to get to that outcome changes. And that's what's currently messing up a lot of the systems we're currently playing in.
But billable hours still pay the bills. This is why they're called billable hours. So independent from the outcome, you can create value for your own business model, which is kind of a problem if you work in consultants or in agencies and you work with projects or campaigns or whatever. They don't make sense, but you still spend time realizing whatever result without delivering. And then that ends up being cost pressure on other projects that do deliver value, but they have the same kind of constraints based on the inefficiency or the inefficient use of human labor throughout the whole company. There is no equal balance in terms of hours spent versus outcomes. So you have like the typical Gaussian curve where you have like very high value with very little people, and then you have the total opposite throughout the whole company.
Yeah. Where do you see most of these inefficiencies in agencies? I mean, you've worked in a few, so maybe you've got some insights.
Ironically, in supporting processes, what you see a lot, and we will talk about this later probably as well, in terms of if you give agency people AI, what they tend to do is the same what developers do with AI is they use it for their core process, right? So they want to code faster with AI, or a creative wants to do more creatives with AI, a copywriter wants to do more text with AI. So we end up building more of the same, which is kind of a problem, right? Because if we create more of the same in less time, it starts kind of cannibalizing our own business model. Like you remember with billable hours, you've got charged for mostly like hourly rates, or so this ends up sabotaging your own business model in a way, unless you've been charged for item prices. But anyways, if you're charged for item prices, you already ended up where you didn't want to ever end up, in a kind of creative factory, right? This is the total nightmare of every creative agency if you have like item prices, because it means it's totally comparable. You just want 50 creatives or whatever the number is, and you want 100 concepts or something, and then there's a deliverable and there's a checklist, and you're just trying to make check marks and say you delivered 50 creatives, right? And then they have to fulfill some kind of metrics, but what you can count, you value, right? This is the saying they have. So Probably it's also the wrong incentives, because you don't incentive quality output, rather a certain amount of deliverables per month or per retainer or whatever the pricing model will be. And that ends up being in a poorer quality, because you just try to finish whatever item you have because you're getting paid for it anyways. It doesn't matter if it's 80% quality or 100% quality. You end up thinking about the next item, the next item, the next item.
So the KPIs that you choose to get measured by or measure your output by obviously define what that output is. So if you don't optimize for actual business goals, that's one of my biggest critiques with social media as well. If you don't optimize for business goals, but for things like views or impressions, you do everything to optimize for these goals, but you don't actually achieve anything because maybe it's the wrong impressions. Maybe the quality of these impressions is just shit. Maybe you just reach the wrong people. So that's one very big aspect that I think that we need to change in marketing, is to create better KPIs and measure what we do by metrics that matter to business rather than to some vanity metrics.
Yeah, totally. Since you brought up vanity metrics, I think that's also strongly correlates with the sheer size of the number, because the metrics that have like more zeros in it tend to have more vanity, right? Because if you say like, I created, I don't know, 1.5 times more sales, that doesn't sound so much, right? But if you say I created like 10 million impressions, it sounds way more impressive. But the 1.5 sales factor is quite more relevant for business, right? But those metrics don't end up in these kind of agency decks, because like the whole incentives, as well as from the platform sides or from the medias, they really try to make you believe that, which is true to a certain degree, that impressions equal later sales volume, let's say it,
Yeah.
to a certain
Market
degree.
penetration.
But totally, but
Absolutely.
that's not the natural law where you can totally say, I'll spend 1 million in reach and then I'll end up having this kind of conversation in 3 to 6 months later, which makes the whole kind of concept obsolete. And then again, what we didn't talk about in terms of fragmented market sizes, that you end up having 6 to 12 different agencies, because you mentioned like missing lead agencies, which ends up that everybody's chasing their own kind of vanity metrics, and they're not talking to each other to a certain degree, or they're only talking to each other by using the client as a kind of a spokesman, which means they don't end up pursuing the same goal. One person is optimizing for page speed, the second one is optimizing for conversion rate, the next one is optimizing for whatsoever. But at the end, we're all looking at the same kind of client, but no one is really watching the client. We are all having these kind of proxy metrics that give us the feeling we are watching the client, but we actually aren't, because nobody's talking to the client, nobody's asking the client what he likes and what he doesn't. And then we end up just making some pinpoint kind of thumbs up or whatever the reaction is, where we can interact with our client, but we don't really do customer centricity in our playbooks, so that our marketing is really aligned with our strategic goals.
I also think that on top of that, if a client doesn't go into a meeting and asks how you're going to measure your results, or this is the KPI we're going to measure you on, if they don't ever mention KPIs in a meeting, that, how to put it, that it's a move to be able to later on shift blame, because if you measured nothing, you can also not be measured by it, and therefore not have to prove that anything you did actually worked or didn't work. And I think we're moving into a time where being able to prove that you moved the needle in some way is actually really important.
Totally. And again, like we're all talking about the same client, but you have like these different incentives and also kind of these modes in between some different silos in the company, where people don't end up talking to each other about the same client they're all trying to reach in their kind of sales customer journey. So whatever ends up in being like a very fragmented kind of user experience. So you flip sides and you're the customer, you have one story in social media, you have a totally different experience in customer service. The on-site experience is also quite different. Then you end up going to a store. In the store, they don't know what actually has been communicated on social media. And so this story doesn't match. So to a certain degree, the kind of complexity we ended up with all these different channels ends up being a problem of the brands and the customers in the same way. So coordinating these kind of different initiatives is probably 20 to 30% of the job, and we don't creating value there. We're just trying to make sure it's in a way consistent, and we're trying to do it with the same playbook we've been doing it in the past, kind of these strict kind of guidelines, etc. But you rather need some kind of a more sophisticated way to elaborate corporate language, corporate style, corporate behavior and all that stuff, but rather it's not written down and printed down forever, like for 2 or 3 years in a row, but rather in a more dynamic way where we decide on a very fluent way whether we proceed with this kind of strategic initiative or we switch lanes or strategies based on the actual live outcome. And this is kind of the thing where agents as well as clients don't have a real playbook for, because they were used to steering in one direction for a very long time and only making minor shifts, not so much in not placing so much big bets on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I do. Another aspect of that is that the whole premise of having an agency is having repeatable processes that create efficiencies and shared overheads that reduce cost per player in the agency. And I think the whole shared overheads thing, that's well understood, but I think the repeatable processes as part of agency work is very underrated and very underutilized and requires a lot of transformation, especially with what's to come. What's your take on that?
Basically, like the whole concept of a full service agency nowadays requires a lot of people, because if you're really full service, it really means you need a very high kind of service level as well as a kind of very big expertise. Because like in the early days, you could probably do a website, you could also do a little bit of social media, you could do a little bit of that, and there was not a real expert in this field because it was also new. You need a single person for each social media channel, right? You need a single person for each individual marketplace to a certain degree. You need different players based on the whole data you collect. And what you see that this kind of diversification in terms of service models didn't really created a similar structure in agencies. It did at a certain scale. If you look at these kind of aggregators in terms of super large players like WPP, Omnicom, and all these media players, they did really build these kind of structures basically with M&A. But what you do see is that the mid-sized companies, let's say 100 people and less, really struggle to keep up with the demand and complexity of today's market while serving at a high level. If they specialize and say we are the best, I don't know, Amazon agency with 100 people, they don't have a problem because they work very well in the Amazon space. But if they say we are your full service agency and we serve you with the 100 different tasks, they will probably have a big trouble, A, creating value, B, creating new clients, and C, making a very tangible business for the future.
If I want to know what this agency stands for, it's obviously a lot easier to see what they do if they do a singular thing really well and have deep expertise in that one thing, rather than saying, oh, I've got an agency here that claims that they can do everything.
Yeah, but acknowledging from where they actually come from, this is like your overhead calculation from the earlier, is the overall idea in full service was quite good. There's a lot of synergies between different channels because we have to communicate in different channels quite the same to make sure our messages are consistent. We do have synergies in using the same assets all over again whatsoever. And on client side, they focus on their core processes like building a product whatsoever, so they don't end up pushing their efforts so much into marketing and gave everything in terms of marketing. And we're not just talking about promotion, we also talk about prices and the other piece directly to an agency that were able to help them succeed in the kind of distribution monetization space, right? So if they did that in these early days, this was quite a good approach because you could really do all the complexity was been pushed away. Like with all the distribution, like you have in D2C companies, where you decided earlier, you give everything to your trade partners and you're not involved in distributing your manufactured goods. You just you're just the one giving the goods away, right? And you had some kind of a similar approach with agencies early on. Nowadays, most people say, we want to manage that. The problem with all these specialized players is you probably have the best Amazon agency, but you still have a problem with your brand, or you still have a problem understanding your key market or your competitors or whatsoever. And then you end up like building yourself some kind of a team in terms of different players that help you out in certain problem spaces, but you miss up this kind of lead agency role that tries to make sense of a bigger picture and decides, why do we play in all these channels? We can simply stop doing this, and focus on something else. And so again, if you have this fragmented market, you have the wrong incentives again, and everybody's doing the same on every playing field just to keep up consistent, and the marketing budget is almost similarly spent on all the channels, which doesn't make sense, because you could simply say a little bit more no to certain channels and formats and focus on there where you really make a difference for your client.
Very underrated what you just said, because a lot of companies play in certain channels because they see other companies play in those channels without actually questioning the core function of marketing. Who is it for, and are they even there?
Yeah, it's just sending messages.
Just sending messages to the wrong people doesn't really help your business again.
Yeah.
You might get big numbers, but if you don't reach your actual customers, why are you in that channel? Anyways, let's get back onto the processes thing, because I think most agencies have no clear understanding of the process of the creation of their work. And I think that's a big issue with all of the AI agents coming in, because they struggle with knowing where in the process they should place those and how to integrate them consistently.
Yeah.
What's your take on this?
There has been a real struggle in agencies struggling to differentiate in a way. So you have this kind of service commoditization. So everything that has been hard in the past, like doing text or stuff, really gets under a very, very heavy price pressure. And then what you also see in kind of these bigger constructs is that you have these kind of holdings in terms of M&A. They really try to cut down margins, cost cuts. And there's a way you can lose culture in a certain way, where it's kind of hard to use AI in a way it makes sense. So what you will end up seeing is that the same agencies that have been trying to try to raise their margin in a way, use AI for exactly that. So they try to use AI for bottom line use cases. So they really try to make processes more efficient, which doesn't mean that they challenge the processes in general, because you maybe have 6 different agencies, you do have an M&A process where you try to find some synergies in terms of supporting processes, sales, even maybe in terms of HR and stuff, but you don't end up challenging the overall concept, what it means to create ads, basically, or how you actually measure the success of ads, or how you cluster ads, or how you make sense of a kind of a strategy approach in terms of ads, and how do you spend differently and stuff. So they end up producing the same what clients ask for. They say we want 4 creatives, they get 4 creatives, but the approach could be, no, we deliver you 16 assets, right? And we have a process that can tell us afterwards what kind of messagings work best for different target groups. So they could change the whole service model, but this isn't how most of them use AI. They rather try to do what they've always done, just more quicker. Like really making the current development even more fast in terms of they're not changing stuff. They're already kind of cementing their current status and putting it on steroids.
What would you do different?
I would start with jobs to be done, actually, because I think what clients actually looking for is they want efficiency. And this is what people end up doing with AI as well. They want reliable results in the future, because everything is super, super uncertain at the moment. You see all these kind of crises, you see all this kind of uncertainty, you see all these kind of expectations, and everybody's trying to make sense, which means people don't really challenge the status quo, because there's so much going on. And so like everything in terms of AI, a new competitor, you can choose whatever the scenario or the threat is, comes up adding to whatever is already there. You don't get incentivized for saying, I have a great idea. Let's just change how our whole operating system is. Nobody in an agency will do this on their own, because they will end up being the person who has all the problems at the same time. But they really need to do that, because if they don't, they end up really cannibalizing their own business model, because they're just making whatever if they've done even faster, rising or creating even more pressure on the margins and the hourly rates.
And the pressure doesn't only come from within, the pressure comes from the outside as well, with
Totally.
clients saying, I know you use AI.
I want it
Now
tomorrow. I want it now. Why does it
cheaper.
take so long?
Yeah, why does it take so long? Why isn't it so beautiful as I wanted it yet? Can't you just easily do that? Isn't that AI?
Yeah. And so that's the whole point. Like, agencies really need to combine this kind of creativity and tech in a kind of hybrid organization, which they have not been done yet. Because yes, they do use AI for creating text or visuals, but still they didn't build systems that are designed to build more consistent, better results all the time, right? You've been working in agencies as well. You don't see kind of a factory approach in terms of how to make creativity work. Nobody's saying you need some kind of, you need to stand still and produce all the time, but you need some kind of a system or kind of method to consistently produce an output which works in the requirements that are really from the market, as well as they work from a learning perspective. So if you're a junior, you're coming in and you want to understand how good creatives work, you learn it by doing. That's not at all state of technology. You could really make sure that even the onboarding of your new juniors works super intuitively, very, very native, very kind of a ChatGPT way. Do you want to know how good creatives work? Do you know what attribution is? And you could really teach your juniors the same kind of stuff they normally learn in 6 months, just from the basics in a couple of weeks, right? And then they would be able to do the work of a senior, at least in a certain area of a task, without the client really realizing. And then you could offer it to a lower price. But what you end up doing is you give everybody the same tools, you put the same level of efficiency on everybody, and then you end up getting mediocre results because everybody's under time pressure.
I think I've seen a few implementation of this principle, and it's something that you from a guy you quoted recently in an article you wrote as well, Michael Farmer, who said most of the value of a creative agency actually comes from creating the concept. And that might take a lot of hours, but then a lot of the time, or most of the time in agencies, is actually spent on creating derivatives of that initial concept.
Yeah.
And that can easily be done and outsourced to AI agents, for example. And the process there is also currently changing. And it's beautiful, actually, because it means that maybe in the future, agents can get paid even more to create even better and even more thought through concepts rather than just for creating 10 assets or whatever. In theory, the amount of assets is infinite as long as the idea and the adoption process is somewhat standardized.
Yeah. Agencies work in a way that, like, your barber would say, I used the scissor 75 times. And you say, I don't care. I just look at the haircut. And that's pretty much the thing that we are doing. We are really in love with our kind of metrics to say how we hold the scissors and what kind of the scissor we're using and what kind of campaign it is and how good we can cut and so on, and how long you've been there in the salon and stuff. It all doesn't matter. You go there with a clear image of what you want, and you go out there with a kind of result, and you either like it or you don't. And from a very simple standpoint, that's actually what clients are looking for. Of course, there's a kind of maturity level, and they have more sophisticated requirements, and they need some more safety in terms of what you can deliver. But at the end, we end up losing ourselves in metrics or dimensions, which the client cares about zero, really zero. And this really makes the whole systems quite inefficient, because if you start with jobs to be done, you wouldn't probably build campaigns like you do it nowadays. You probably start with an idea, then you test it with real users, you talk to real clients, then you maybe test some of the concepts with social media and see how people respond. You test some different motives in time of psychology, then you change some different approaches, and everything you would probably do would be very iterative. And once you found something that works, you start scaling it. But then most agencies wouldn't probably have the structure of producing content in an amount in a short time on a very high level of quality, because there was this illusion that every process or every campaign or every client is different. That's actually not true, because you see all the cars driving outside, they all drive on wheels, and most manufacturers use different or very similar machines to build totally different products. But we don't have this kind of system approach in terms of producing creativity. But if we would, like you said, find ourselves again in what we are creating value with, we would totally shift our focus from execution to creation again. And then this kind of needs a new kind of education for clients as well, to say, we are paid for the idea, not the execution, because the execution is very understandable. We need X hours to produce 100 creatives. That's fine. We can discuss with the sales team on how much billable hours we put in there. It's cool, but you don't end up building something that's really sustainable. It really will flip, and AI will really flip the kind of complexity issue, because one of the reasons why most companies hired agencies is because it was just too complicated to produce the assets. Once they found out that they can do them themselves, they started doing it themselves. And this is the bigger motive in that it's not so complicated anymore to build the kind of core components that have been previously kind of the creative domain, right? Do some text, do some images, do some videos, and everything now comes with a click on a button and everybody can do it now. Still not on the same level, obviously, but everything that differs you now is the idea. But most of the agencies haven't been paid for the idea, but for the execution.
Yeah, the execution is where most of the money gets put nowadays. Looking at what an agency would look like in the future, if you were to start an agency right now, would you even start one? Well, say you would.
Yeah.
What aspects would you think about, and how would you draw up the processes to create something that creates value for the marketing team of a client?
You have to acknowledge what's already there in the market. Like you would build a SaaS product, right? You wouldn't probably say, I have a great idea for product X and build it. You would probably go out either with a hypothesis or talk to people in a different way to say, what's your problem at the moment, right? And then understand the problem of your potential clients, and then build some service for it, right? And I would totally address the issue like that. I would even address it the very same way if I would have an agency now, because it does make sense to very much ask again, what's your biggest problem at the moment? Because ironically, you could still have 10 agencies and still have major problems. But wait, you still have 10 agencies, right? You still pay a lot of people to fix these problems. Ironically, there are still problems left which have not been tackled by this kind of landscape. So I would really try to understand in whether it makes sense to be the next, I don't know, Amazon, Shopware, or whatever agency, or I do something else which helps my client to solve a bigger problem, maybe understand where more budget creates more value, or where I can reach potential new clients, or understand how I can make a better product market fit with new products, or understand how I can make my brand more internationalized, and rather not talk about channels, not talk about different categories like shop or CRM, but rather try to solve something much bigger and then come to the back door in terms of a lead kind of role. What consultancies are doing at the moment, because assuming one of the problem why agencies, or many of the agencies I know in the past, work the way they work is because they were too afraid of numbers and doing the hard work in trying to understand the products and as well as the performance in different markets. And the thing that consulting firms did much better is not to start with an idea, but rather start with a clear status quo, and not just to make your idea more worthwhile, right? Just to understand what's the real problem. And maybe you don't know, and then you end up saying, we have 3 major problems here, here, and here. What can we do about it? And then start with the ideation afterwards. And what most agencies start with is, I do have a brilliant idea. Yes, but it comes out of nowhere. You probably should start with the problem first. I know it's not so catchy, but I think the reality takes a little bit more appreciation, and try to understand your client, your industry, the niche he is in, the special target group he probably has, and then to understand what creates value for your client and for your client's clients, and then build an idea around that. Again, you're wrongly incentivized in building something without asking all these questions, and then you end up building something that hasn't value.
That sounds an awful lot like strategy has a return in the age of AI.
It has to, because like if you can produce infinite assets like this, the only thing that works is to understand which kind of strategy works with the creatives, because you probably have not so much money that you can pull limitless ads. So you have to understand what kind of patterns work. And so the task of probably a creative strategist, using some AI tools to understand what performance works best for your new products or for your attribution or for different target groups is total key. It's maybe even more important than the creative itself, because you understand a winning pattern and you can reproduce it. And it works the same with campaigns. After a while, you understand what works, even if you repeat it, and what works and ends up working after 2 or 3 times. And then if you understand these patterns, you start building a kind of a rhythmic playbook and say, this kind of, I don't know, campaign type only works half a year or once a year. And this kind of pattern works almost every day. And we keep scaling it and focus on the bigger picture.
That's absolutely one side of it, that you need to become a lot more iterative and have a strategic approach to what works. The other thing I always preach about at the moment is that in an age where you can do everything, because these tools will be able to basically produce anything you can imagine, it still takes people that know what is good or what good looks like or what quality looks like in order to prompt and then judge what comes out of these prompts and to give the whole thing a direction. What's your take on this?
Yeah, pretty much that's probably what has always been the job of a creative director. Assuming he's not involved in operations, which is not true most of the way, but in theory, the creative director shouldn't be involved, as well as like head of roles are very, very operative nowadays, which isn't actually what they're doing, because normally they should really foster talent, try to find new people, upsell with clients and bond and try to understand how to help them, right? This is kind of my kind of old school way on what leadership means in terms of, as well as from an in-house perspective. But you really end with a lot of the same if you can't tell what you really want. And this starts with because you decide on what you like. The problem actually starts with the briefing from the client. And then it ends up being very blurred out at the end after more people are involved in the process. It's like the old game where you like whisper in somebody's ear. And so the briefing process from the client is probably too siloed, probably has too little budget, probably doesn't have an A/B kind of approach in it. And then people really need the money. They'll do it. They execute it. It works. Like the most of the times it works averagely. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad, but it was okay. Let's do the next thing, right? And this is actually how it works. And everybody's too busy with the process. So really there's no judging, basically no judging, because everybody has to know you really have to do it from A to Z. You can say, I want the hair is a little bit different or the background, but you can't change the whole concept because you already put too much work inside. And that's actually the big problem at the moment, where you use AI to do more of the same. But you could, in theory, do more totally different approaches based on your assumption what works creatively. And because you don't take so much time in the execution, you could test way more campaigns, way more approaches, and then understand what works very well, and then focus on the winning result, right? Which still needs your kind of expertise in deciding initially what to test, right? But then you have to, and I really mean it, you have to accept that some things don't work with the market, and you have to focus on what works best with your idea in this kind of fanned out approach in terms of messaging. But at the moment, you just see a lot of very kind of stupid approaches in doing the same with AI quicker and faster and deliver just more and expecting more results or more margin, but both probably won't work.
So agencies are currently underutilizing AI in terms of what it can do for them, and are overusing it in ways that actually don't help them, but are actively undercutting what margins and revenues they can create.
Totally, because my assumption would be You could theoretically not use AI, wait for this, not use AI in text or creatives at all. And you could still be the winner in AI. Why? Because you use AI for everything else, for your meetings, for your operating system, for testing creatives whatsoever. You could still do all of the kind of photography, texting manually if you have a very good operating system and you know what you're doing, you know what questions to ask to your client, if you know what numbers to look at if you talk to your client, if you know what numbers to look at if you're testing a creative, if you know how to fan out different kind of approaches in if anything works, and then if you know how to adapt maybe different creatives with automation, you need zero AI for that. You probably outperform every AI first agency that doesn't know what they're doing. So this is the major problem, because everybody tries to hammer faster with AI, but rather the question is, why do you have a hammer in your hand anyways? You probably need a different tool. And this is like kind of a systemic way end to end to look at the whole process, what comes in and what comes out. And these cycles will be very, very short. And the whole question is, who's touching what part of the process, to what extent, with what output.
There was one aspect that you maybe understood differently than I said it earlier, which is that you have to know what you like and want in terms of the creative. But obviously it's all about the person seeing the creative output has to like it. I don't want people to get that wrong with me. I obviously always think about what the actual viewer or the actual recipient of the work has to receive. And that's where there's the whole black hole thing, and where we always work based on gut value or based on some vague numbers of, oh, these people might like this topic based off a questionnaire of 30,000 people in Germany that tries to be representative but isn't really. People like sports. Yeah, so wow.
Yeah, that's ironic, because it's easier than ever to ask clients. You can do a focus group in 48 hours easily. You can talk to synthetic users in seconds. You can really digest the social internet and the forums to understand what people actually want. And ironically, most of the people aren't doing it. And they rather stick to their classical process where they say, I've always done it that way. My gut feeling is quite good. Look at all these awards, I can still do it. Even if your ancestor probably won't. So you need to make sure that all other teams members either also kind of get that gut feeling too, or you even train an AI to produce that gut feeling, would be a very interesting approach. Or you find ways to also validate your gut feeling against real data.
Or you just talk to people. That was one thing that came out of the StratCon. Strategists and agencies have unlearned to just go into the world and ask someone in the target group, hey, what do you think about this? I recently got onboarded to some client in the baking space. And the first thing I did was walk up to the next bakery and ask the baker, what do you think about this thing? What gets you to do this or buy this or go there? And I got some really quality answers that changed a few things that we do about that. So
yeah,
it's crazy.
Yeah, and a good place to start is actually, again, never underestimate that if you spend time on it, it's really hard to go back again to zero, right? If you start building a creative and you did two days and doing some kind of crazy cinematic kind of a visual, it's super hard to say people don't like it, you have to do it again, because doing it again means all the time you've spent on it was like useless. I know we all do different kind of routes and stuff, but again, it would be super smart to start not from blank slate anymore, but start with user research, start with user personas, start with market data, start with whatever is, and then use that as a kind of our creative basis for brainstorming. What we do instead is we just talk to the clients or we talk to ourselves, and we don't create any insights because we're just talking to ourselves. And then we do some generic campaign, which can still be funny, can still be good. I'm not saying it's all wrong, but I say the whole process is wrong, that we at least should talk to clients in a way that we're really interested in what they are saying. And we can also use some kind of synthetic twins of them. But I would really recommend talking to clients more often, especially to your clients in the agency, because they will tell you what you could charge more for if you start delivering it. Better reports, better insights, more alternative approaches, more kind of a consulting approach, whatever, and find out what they're really willing to to pay you more in price premium, right? And not talk so much with them about how you can cut cost and how you can produce more creatives or something, because this is actually part of your cutting down your own business model. It would be super interesting to understand what's the real problem of your clients, not so much of the clients of your clients, but your clients, and then understand how you need to adapt your service models.
That's quite a strong word for the end, or towards the end of our podcast. At the end of our podcast, I always ask my clients what the last time was that they felt like a company went out of their way to create value for them. Do you have any example that comes to mind?
A company that created value for me?
Yeah, beyond what you expected.
I have this a lot with event hosters. So I'm always super happy if I see there's somebody personally involved in a kind of event, and it really makes sure you have a good time, starting from booking your hotel, talking to you about in detail, introducing you to some of the people, ending up to give you some advice here and there, and all the kind of stuff you don't have to do actually, because I'm on a lot of events, as you know, and you see a very big difference in terms of you can still say hi, there's the stage, go there, or you can really treat people not just with respect, but with a kind of very personal kind of one-to-one, something that doesn't scale, by the way, kind of approach. And I really appreciate this and start posting for these events like crazy, really supporting them, giving them speaker tips and stuff. And so I really try to level up with the kind of service they provide by giving them something from my point of view. You probably have similar experiences with different events. You see a very big shift in terms of professionalism, as well as a kind of eye-to-eye understanding. And very nice that you're here. They send you letters and stuff, and others don't even give you a ticket. So this is kind of super interesting that you see these kind of different service level a lot in physical events, where you see somebody doing like 100 out of 100 score, and some others where you're like totally disappointed and think, I would have expected something much more professional and friendly.
Is there any topic that we haven't talked about, any question we haven't asked, anything that's still on your mind that you really want to shout into the world and get people to hear? Is there anything you want people to know about you professionally? Now's the time for that.
I would really, really recommend everybody to take some time with AI, because especially if you're a more senior person, take your time, and I really mean it, take your time to use it without any productivity pressure. Try to understand how these systems work for you, with you, and also get some professional help if you really need this. But at the beginning, focus on your strength, right? Because you're probably a senior, been doing this for 10 to 15 years. You're very well educated in you giving some people some briefings, you get something in return. It's not quite what you asked for, but you learned in your past 5 to 10 years to really make sense of what you receive and give some proper feedback on the next iteration. It's the total same with these kind of systems. And I still see many people which are not so techy, which really hesitate on using these kind of tools because they say they're stupid, they're not working for me. And I'm not sure so much about that, but I rather think they need some more time with it to understand it really serves them based on the quality of the feedback they give back. And that's something they have to learn, that it works equivalently to a human person. And if you're more senior, these technologies work in your favor because you've learned and you've been trained on giving feedback for years. You can really articulate what's good and what's bad. And you need to learn to do this quite extensively, a lot more, and then these technologies help you do twice or even more of the stuff, and you can focus on whatever is more important to you and write not so much emails, presentations, and whatever you do which doesn't make sense for you and doesn't create value.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.